Bruce Bowser, one of those prominent entrepreneurs, business guys, gives back to the community.
Mr. Bowser, there's been breakthrough advances with autonomous self-driving technology in recent years. My question is, how great of an impact do you believe this technology will have on your industry, and how does your company intend on implementing such technologies within its operations?
So I read your readings in your handouts, and being in the transportation industry, the trucking industry in particular, I take a keen interest in how slowly we've advanced when it comes to applying technology to the trucking industry. And I think even the readings you had kind of speak to, the industry being somewhat antiquated. So I like to think that there's a lot more we can do as an industry to quickly embrace parts of technology that would help us to get closer to having autonomous vehicles. So for the last year, I personally drive a Tesla, love it. It drives, my daughters will attest that it drives much better than I do. When I put that on auto drive, it responds quicker. And my daughters say they get car sick far less often when it's driving than when I'm driving. But the sad part is that almost every car you buy at a dealership today has some form of autonomous assistance built into it. So whether it's keeping you in the lane, whether it's measuring the distance between you and the car in front of you to keep you at a safe stopping distance, we haven't seen that in the transportation industry. And if I had my way, and I have been an advocate for it, and I've had lots of opportunities to speak to the government about the fact that we should mandate some of that technology that exists today at a very low cost into the trucking industry. And by that, I mean a few things. One, trucks, when they do get in accidents, so large trucks when they get in accidents, cause horrific damage. So some of the worst accidents we see on the roads are caused by trucks barreling into several cars at the same time. And usually that can be traced back to some form of driver error. So the driver's either being distracted, and that driver would be in good company with everybody else in the world today because we live in a world where everybody's distracted with some form of texting, unfortunately, in a vehicle. And if those vehicles had the ability to stop, like we see with cars, or to at least shake the wheel and warn the driver that there's an impending collision coming, or if the driver's distracted or falling asleep, and the studies show that drivers, because of the nature of their business, it's boring. They fall asleep several times an hour, like for just moments. But if the truck is changing lanes, and it had a system in that that you can get in a Toyota Camry, the entry-level vehicles, I think we would prevent thousands of accidents. So the concern is this: we talk about the future of autonomous trucks. I'm a huge Elon Musk fan, and I think we'll get there someday. But the infrastructure we have today doesn't support that, and we would need to create roads that would allow autonomous trucks. I'd love to see us create a lane between Toronto and Montreal, which is a power lane in the transportation industry, where we take the passing lane and we make that trucks only. We put a concrete barrier between that and other vehicles, and we make sure that those drivers have, if you read your paper, there's 5 levels of autonomous driving, maybe level 2 or level 3, where the driver has to be behind the wheel, but he has all these warning systems, or she has all these warning systems that would stop impending accidents and would protect the rest of the vehicle. So Ralph didn't want to talk much about autonomous trucks. I'm not an expert in it. I think that is the future of the trucking industry, the transportation industry. In some ways, when I get asked to talk about it, I say it's not that different than what we do with the rail business. Rails, that's almost autonomous. The person driving the rail car doesn't change lanes, occasionally, but it's a safe way. They're separated from cars. The only time they have issues is when cars cross in front of them. But I think we're moving in that direction. My guess is by the time we are fully autonomous with self-driving trucks, Elon will have completed that either Hyperloop below ground or above ground system, and trucks will be obsolete. So
the corporate social responsibility is becoming increasingly important. for companies operating around the world. More consumers are starting to educate themselves on the companies they choose to deal with based on their commitments and other socially responsible initiatives. In response, many companies are joining certifications and other voluntary codes in order to promote their social responsibility. After going to AMJ Campbell's website, I noticed that it stated AMJ Campbell was one of the first Canadian movers to gain FAIM designation, and that they only selected FAIM certified companies as their partners. I was wondering if you could explain the objective of FAIM certification and how AMG was able to acquire it, and what this means for customers who decide to use AMG services across the globe.
You know, I can speak a bit to, as president of the company, a bit to, you know, our vision around social responsibility, you know, whether it be, you know, to the environment or to the people we employ and service. You know, I like to think that we're probably on the cutting edge of a lot of transportation companies in terms of trying to reduce our carbon footprint. You know, in the last 2 years, through an innovation that we developed, which is a container. It looks a bit like a pod, and you can move it via rail and other modes of transportation. We've managed to take 700 trailers off of the road in North America, which you know, has a huge impact on the carbon footprint we leave behind. And you know, if I had my way, you know, we'd be a lot farther down that road. But yeah, I'd have to ask the president of our international division what that FAME accreditation is. Sorry.
You have extensive experience in holding influential positions within corporations, including being the president and CEO of AMJ Campbell Van Lines and president and CEO of Cambec Corporation, to name a couple. So in addition to this, you sit on the board of a variety of organizations, including a number of charitable foundations. Considering your background, what have you noticed to be the key sustainability factors and strategies for both for-profit and nonprofit organizations, and how have they changed over the last few decades?
Some of the charities that I've chose to work with throughout my working career, you know, one of the reasons that I would choose to work with an organization that's doing charity work would be, you know, is it providing sustainable solutions to problems? And so, you know, we've got involved with organizations that support world hunger, you know, absolving world hunger, and Ralph, you know, there would be a good example of, you know, feed a man a fish, or a person a fish, and you feed them for a day, teach them to fish, and they eat forever. And you know, to me, that's what sustainability is about: is helping people to develop to the point where they can sustain themselves. So I touched a little bit about, you know, sustainability for profit. I mean, our organization, our company is, you know, an example of, you know, for us to be sustainable long term, you know, we need to look at issues like, you know, how green are our vehicles? Are we efficient? Hopefully, we'll talk a little bit today about, you know, some of the things we've been able to do using Watson's artificial intelligence in our business to help us become, you know, far more efficient. You know, to help with things like routing. So instead of having a truck, you know, on the road for 6 hours, like might have happened 2 or 3 years ago, delivering product because of, you know, being able to use predictive analytics, and we use Watson, you know, we're now able to shorten that route from 6 hours down to, you know, to 4 hours, which, you know, takes a truck off the road for 2 hours. You know, things like our containers help promote sustainability.
Recently, a hot topic for good corporate governance dictates that leaders should influence a company's guiding values and ethical climate by setting the tone at the top. What initiatives and processes you and your leadership team follow to ensure that the tone is set, and how could you discuss how do you make sure expectations and guiding values are followed across all EMG's 50 locations?
Thank you. And I think so we're going to get into some of the things that Dr. Lean was wanting to razz me on, but you know, I think we live in a day now where, you know, because of things like, you know, digital devices, cell phones, computers, just we're so connected that companies like my own have come to somehow expect that we have access to our employees 24/7. And so, you know, 3 or 4 years ago, if I was traveling on an airplane to Calgary, for example, or some other part of the world, I would get on the plane and I might pound out 80 emails. I'd get caught up because there's no distraction on an airplane. And I would land, and without any regard for what time it was, all those emails would go out to our employees across the company. And it didn't matter if it was 8 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night, didn't matter if, if the manager receiving that email was out having dinner with their spouse, they got an email from me. And because, I was one probably paying for their handheld device or their laptop, I somehow thought that I had 24/7 access to them. There's been a huge movement. I'm a big supporter of it, just wrote a book about it, about this whole notion of employees being entitled to a life. I mean, lawyers don't get it. They still think that, people should work 60, 70, 80 hours a week. But in our company, one of the things we've done as a leadership group is we've implemented a policy the last year and a half that drives Dr. Lean crazy. But if you send me an email before 6 a.m., after 6 p.m., and or on the weekends, you get a response back saying that AMJ has adopted a work-life balance, and we don't send or receive emails before 6 a.m., after 6 p.m., or on the weekends. If you're a customer and you need to reach me or for something important, I give you my cell number. What a novel idea that is. You could call me. And in the course of a year and a half that we've had this policy, nobody's called me. I mean, we're not saving lives. We're moving people. We're transporting goods. And, I use the example of when I was a young bank manager 25, 30 years ago. If I needed to, this was prior to cell phones, prior to email, all we had was faxes and telephones. If I needed to reach you, and I'm sorry, is it Dina? No.
Brenda.
Brenda. If you worked with me and I needed to reach you in the evenings, I'd actually have to think about what you were doing. So if I had to pick up, I had to call you. So if it was 7 o'clock in the evening, I had to think, wonder what Brenda's doing. She's probably eating, doing something, like it's after hours. And so the likelihood of me doing that in the evening or the weekend, unless we were working together on a project that was time sensitive, didn't happen. Today, the lines have become so blurry that there's expectation that, that we should be working 24/7, to the point where, if somebody does send me an email and I don't respond, I get this, this call like, Bowser, what the hell's going on? I sent you an email at 7 o'clock last night and I didn't hear back till this morning. And so, oh my goodness, are you going to be okay? So I think that, that like a lot of things in life, technology, I love technology, but technology has moved at such a pace that the pendulum has swung too far one way and it needs to swing back a little bit. And, we're living, every time you pick up a newspaper today, you read about the effect that addiction to digital distraction and constantly being connected is having on people. I mean, nobody feels like they have weekends anymore. I mean, our company, our employees, when we first started doing this, was like, oh my goodness, like after a month or two, or a month and a half, they'd actually feel like it was their evenings or their weekends, that they could actually leave their device home and not have to worry about being, contacted by somebody. So
in this digital age, you've been a successful business person and made AMJ Campbell the largest moving company in Canada. You've been featured on many mainstream channels to defend your view on taking the company private when it was listed on TSX. My question to you is that what was the main reason that you took the company private? And what were some of the hurdles that you had to face from your investors and stakeholders? In addition to that, will AMJ Campbell go public in coming future or will it remain private? Thanks.
When I first joined AMJ Campbell, we were a publicly traded company, traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. In 2001, we went through a hostile takeover bid and became private, and we're currently private. The event that happened in 2001, which was a hostile takeover bid, was not something that was welcomed, or it wouldn't be called hostile. We were the target of another group wanting to buy us, and we didn't want to be sold. And so at the time, I was able to raise a ton of money. I thought I was clever at the time until I had to start paying it back. But at the time, I was able to go to the banks and raise enough money to outbid the hostile bid and to keep the company intact. And it was a challenging experience. It was, I think, like a lot of entrepreneurs, we have chapters in our history that sound exciting and somewhat glamorous, like going through a hostile takeover bid. But when you're waking up 6 months later saying, oh my goodness, what did I just do? I owe somebody $34 million. and I don't have enough money to make the payment, it humbles you quickly. So it was a great experience. It was the right thing for the company because the company that was looking to acquire us wanted to break it up and sell off the pieces. We were able to keep, our company is 83 years old this year, keep a company that's been around for a long time and will be around for a long time as a result of doing that. In terms of ever going public again, I live in a different era than I did 10 years ago, obviously. But 10, 15 years ago, a lot of people looked for a way to exit. My advice to you as you become leaders in businesses is, think far more about sustainability and long-term health of your business than simply exiting. So, for me, taking the company public again isn't in the cards. What happens after me will, it is a privately held company. I am the majority shareholder. I have no interest in taking it public, no interest in selling the business, no interest in an exit. I have a lot of interest in making sure that our company's around in another 83 years. We employ 3,000 Canadians, and I'd like for it to employ 6,000.
A lot of great leaders and successors have an inspiration or maybe something from their childhood that drove them to get to where they are. My question to you is, what was your inspiration that got you to where you are today? And also, what advice could you give us as you were once a student, just like you were once a student, to succeed as much as you have?
I don't know that there was any one sort of motivation that sort of drove me to do the things that I've done in my business career. I think that I've always been an entrepreneur at heart. From the time I was a young man, I always wanted to. I'm curious, and I think curiosity is one of the key ingredients of entrepreneurs. I was just curious. I wanted to build things. I wanted to grow things. When I joined the company, I wanted to grow the business, and so part of the answer to your question is, I've always had a keen desire to want to grow things, to want to, see things become bigger. I grew up very poor, but I don't think that's the reason, for aspiring. Because my daughters did not grow up very poor, and they have every bit as much incentive and drive as I do. As my oldest daughter, as you know well, Ralph, she makes me look like a flower when it comes to drive. So, but I think my advice. When you ask what advice would I give to you in the room today in terms of your future careers, is you live in an age where you can do more than one career. And so when I grew up, I did multiple things. I changed careers a couple of times. And I know when I left the bank 26 years ago to join AMJ Campbell, all my peers said, "Bruce, you're crazy. You got a great job at the bank." At that time, our parents, they took pride in, nothing wrong with this, but they took pride in working at the same place for 25, 30, 40 years and then retiring. And today we live in an age where, I encourage my daughters to try different things. If my oldest daughter doesn't enjoy law, don't.
She works for me. How could she not enjoy it?
My point. If she doesn't enjoy that, then do something else. You got from the age of 45 onwards, you've got all this time to get old, and you'll find when you get to that age that you have an abundance of time. And hopefully not much regret, but you might wish that you could have done things differently. So my advice to you is, obviously you want to work hard. You don't want to jump jobs just to jump jobs. But don't get stuck in doing something that you're not happy doing. Life's too short.
Did you know what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I think that I knew that I wanted to do something in the world of banking and finance, and that's how I started my career as a banker. But I'm not sure that it was, clearly defined. It sounds a touch arrogant, but I always thought that, I was thinking a little ahead of my time. That, I wanted to do different things, and I didn't care so much about, what the mold said at the time. So, look, my youngest daughter has known since she was 8 years old that she wanted to be a doctor or vet, and she pursued that. She loves it. She's passionate about it. My oldest daughter is more like me. She wasn't sure if she wanted to be a cheerleader or a lawyer. Some days I wish she'd stayed being a cheerleader, but it drove me crazy. But I just think it's important that that you pursue things that you're passionate about, that you enjoy doing.
I was reading your response to Robert Tarrick's book, Vaporized, and I was wondering about the way careers are shifting away from what you have now, 24 years at one company.
26.
26 years, pardon me.
Sorry.
To a gig economy of just a series of contracts, jobs, switching between different companies and lateral moves. Do you think there's still going to be those long-term positions in the future? Or are we going to be stuck being our own entrepreneurs or consultants for different companies for the rest of our lives?
So, touches a bit on the point I was trying to make a few minutes ago, which was my advice, that, I think you should embrace the sense that you can do more than one thing, right? So, not get stuck in doing something that you don't want to do. In terms of long careers, I think, there are opportunities to have long careers both as entrepreneurs and as employees, and there's lots of days I wish I'd have stayed with banking. Banking is a great career, just wasn't for me long term. And then there's lots of days where I work with either consultants, entrepreneurs who go from gig to gig, and they make a lot of money and have a lot of freedom, and some of them charge me huge amounts of money while they're sitting on a balcony in California.
No, I was on Florida when I was charging a lot of that
Exactly. Doing something for our social media or something for our digital marketing. And so, I think both work. And your personality will help determine that. Right? Some people need to have a place to go to every day and need to have the security, for a stable job. Other people love being entrepreneurs and having freedom and flexibility.
So the CFL is in talks to bring a new franchise team to the city of Halifax. I'm wondering how close we are in accomplishing that goal and what it means for the city to finally have a CFL team in Halifax.
I grew up in Halifax, so so I have the Maritimes is my home, and I have a close association and affiliation with the Maritimes. I do love the CFL. It's a Canadian game, and it's not coast to coast. The Maritimes do not have a world-class facility that could house a football game, a large concert, Canada games, any sort of national games. And so a year and a half ago, I was asked by the commissioner at the time of the CFL, being an entrepreneur from Halifax, could I get some of the business people and community leaders in Halifax together to see if there would be an appetite to put a team there. And one of the things that I think I do well as an entrepreneur is connect. And so I connected with a group of my peers in the East Coast, and there was a very high level of desire to do something, and somehow I fell into the role of chairing this bid. There are people that are working the bid that are far more experienced in the area of football. As a matter of fact, the co-partner with me in the bid is the former president and owner of the Phoenix Coyotes. So he understands football and professional sports. But for me, it's about it's a bit of a legacy issue. I think that the Maritime region, the Atlantic Canada, should have a stadium. So a big part of this is about getting a stadium that not only will host 8 to 9 football games a year, but will be a venue where we can do other world-class events.
Okay, so as you said before, you started your career as a banker from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and you have strong roots in the city. Halifax is a city that has continued to grow economically, and it's starting to rival other power cities like Toronto and Vancouver. What does the city of Halifax need to do in order to attract more international investors, and what are you personally doing through your many projects to continue to provide opportunities to youth in Halifax who are looking for similar opportunities that you had?
I think they need a football team. I think because I've been asked to speak, obviously, over the last several months in Halifax and other places about the whole notion of bringing a football team and a world-class stadium and development to the city. And as I travel around the world, the Canadians, and you folks would know this, we're often referred to as being overly humble. And like, we say sorry a lot, and it's like, we're shy. I think Halifax and the Atlantic provinces takes that to a whole new level. I think that, that they don't feel, they feel less than the rest of the country in a lot of areas. But what I see over the last 4 or 5 years in Halifax and the Atlantic region is that they're starting to come of their own. So if you visit Halifax, they've built a huge international trade center right in the heart of the city that rivals anything in the country. And it took them a long time, I think over the last 2 or 3 years, to actually accept that that's who they become. And I think with time, but I know that now that they are attracting more and more tourists and industries. I mean, they actually put a bid in for an Amazon bid, and it was something Amazon actually looked at. I mean, I think every city in North America tried to get a bid for Amazon, but the mayor of Halifax actually went and pitched to Amazon. They had a beautiful piece of property, and just sometimes when you can start thinking outside of this box that holds you in, you see things in a bigger perspective, and I think that's where Halifax is at now. So I think that's why they're now ready to embrace a CFL football team. They're now ready to support a stadium and fill up this international trade center.
It has been noted that you were the keynote speaker for the Toronto Entrepreneurs Conference and Trade Show. As an entrepreneur, there are certain freedoms like setting your own hours, as well as risks like financial loss. Entrepreneurship is very much about failing before you succeed. So my question is, how long should an entrepreneur go through the failing stage before calling it quits? And is there a moment your venture will succeed?
I said earlier, I think every entrepreneur has chapters in their lives, in their careers, where they've had some form of failure. Myself included. I mean, I love this concept that you're probably studying in some of your classes around. If you're going to fail quick, right? I mean, if you know that something is failing, like shut it down quick. So, if you're an entrepreneur, to answer one of your questions, if you're an entrepreneur and you're doing something that is failing, cut your losses quick. I mean, you see that on Dragon's Den. Some of these pitches is like, the good dragons just say, "Whoa, you're not an entrepreneur. Like, just shut that down before you lose everything you have." I mean, you certainly have levels of success, but in terms of being that one moment, I think of some of the things that we've done in our business that are successful. There's always a period where you're testing things, we're piloting things as we speak now, and I mean, maybe 3 or 4 years down the road, you look back and you say, we've gone from a concept to now we have 1,000 of these containers, for example, in our business across the country, and I would call that success. But very few things are just overnight, unless you invented something that was a huge hit, but they don't happen very often.
Yeah. What have you done technologically in your business to take it from an old line business into the new world?
So I think 4 or 5 years ago we started to see a trend in a lot of industries where we call it disruption, where technology was being used to disrupt old established industries. And I use a couple examples. I remember my youngest daughter is now 24. It was only 9 years ago when I was driving her once or twice a week to Blockbusters to pick up a video for her and her friends to watch a movie. And I can't even tell you when 3,000 Blockbuster video stores shut down, but it happened in a very quick period of time because of technology and moving to to digital TV and digital movies. The same thing happened with the taxi business. Uber came along, doesn't own an asset. I mean, their value now is astronomical. So technology being used to disrupt industries is something that I paid attention to 5 or 6 years ago. So we have a think tank in our company which is made up of employees across the board, frontline and senior management. And so we met as a company. I said, look, we need to find ways to look at disrupting our business before others come in and do it for us. So we've done a lot with technology. We're probably not probably, we are the only transportation company in Canada and probably North America that has engaged IBM Watson's artificial intelligence to help our business. And people say, what can artificial intelligence do to a moving industry? We've been able to do things like go back and analyze all of our data over the last 5 years. We do 100,000 moves a year across the country to determine, what our traffic patterns are like. How can we develop dynamic pricing like you see with the airlines? So the airlines match their pricing to capacity, which is why when you go to fly on a holiday, the price is much more expensive than it is on off capacity days. We've been able to build a pricing model that's dynamic, that's based on our past history of when we're busy. We're using Watson to analyze data in terms of how we do our routing, how we dispatch our trucks. Watson actually has a customer service. I'm a big Watson fan, if you haven't gathered that.
What is that? What's Watson?
So Watson is that artificial intelligence computer that everybody knows beat Jeopardy. The game Jeopardy? So Watson.
From a guy you don't watch television. How do you know about that?
Because that's what I speak. I speak on behalf of IBM about Watson, and that's how a lot of people especially people older than myself, identify Watson as the artificial intelligence computer. So I think the answer to the question is we've looked for ways to bring technology into our business. We just recently developed a handheld estimating app that allows you to walk through your own home and do your own estimate, and that grew out of your generation, which is far more about on demand. You don't want to wait for 3 moving companies to come in and do an estimate in your home. You want to be able to do it yourself. And so, I think that's one of our advantages as a company in an older industry, that we forward think a bit. And I've said earlier, I want to be around in 80 years' time, so I need to pay attention to, what I hate using the term millennials because I think you get a bad rap, but what the future generations want.
In an article posted by the Global News, it is said that Canada ranks 34th in a survey of 37 countries for parenting, meaning that Canada is the 4th worst place to have kids, followed by Costa Rica, Mexico, and the US. This data is based on real-time the real time that parents have to spend with their kids. On a Twitter post, you stated that Canada needs to commit to achieving better work-life balance for employed parents. In which ways can Canadian businesses help achieve those goals? And as you're writing a book on this topic, can you provide us with a few sneak peeks and/or tips from your book that encourages this type of lifestyle? And how do you foster this balance within your workplace, specifically within your team?
So, that is, in many ways, the essence of the book that I just co-authored. And I think, there's a lot of questions and a lot of information, but if I could, sort of summarize it a little bit, I think we live in a day-to-day that is causing us to completely rethink the way that my parents grew up, and even a lot of people in my generation. I still think I'm the same age as you folks, so I think differently. But folks like Ralph and people in his profession, they grew up in an era where it was seen as a badge of honor to work 60, 70, 80 hours a week and not to have any work-life balance. Maybe you saw that with some of you saw that with your parents or your grandparents, that we kind of lived in this era where we said, well, when I'm 65, I'm going to retire and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And the reality was, you watched your parents, if they made it to 65, getting their knees replaced, they couldn't do the things they wanted to do, when they said they were going to do them. And so I actually think, I said it a second ago, millennials get a bad rep, and I'll stick with the term millennials. I was at a conference last year listening to a professor speak about millennials. And I think the best description I've heard yet of millennials, and addresses this issue of work-life balance, is the difference between millennials and my generation, even though I'm not in my generation, is, assume I was in my generation, 20 years ago, when I would go to a doctor's office, I would sit across from usually him, and he would be wearing a lab coat, and he'd have a stethoscope around his neck. He would ask me some questions, and he knew what my problem was, and he would give me a prescription or tell me what to do. That's the way it was. We did not question doctors. The same happened in my workplace. I didn't question my boss. Today, millennials, and you already know where this is going, millennials go into the doctor's office, and quite often they're sitting across from she's not wearing a lab coat, doesn't have a stethoscope, and she already knows that the millennial has almost as much information as she does in terms of what's wrong with them. So the key difference is I didn't have access to the information that you have access to today to be able to have the wisdom to go into an example of a doctor. And it's the truth. If any of you here go to a doctor, most of you know by the time you sit in front of that doctor what's wrong with you. You've Googled the H out of it. You know what all the symptoms are. You can see pictures of it. You can send pictures of it. So I think wisdom and knowledge has put millennials in a far better space to challenge the workplace that we live in today. So, so for example, Rolf's not going to like this, but in my book I talk about the fact that, I grew up in an era where, as a bank manager, it was about how many hours I worked to get noticed, right? So it didn't matter what I produced, and and I did climb the ladder quickly as a young banker, but it was about how often I was seen. So I'd be the first one in the office and the last one to leave the office, and I tell you, like half the time I was twiddling my thumbs. I'd be sitting there thinking, get out of here so I can go, right? I need to be the last person out of the office. Today we live in a day where it's more about what your productivity is, what are you producing, than it is about hours spent. So I get into this argument last year as I'm finishing off the book with a lawyer that happened to have sat on a board with me. And my oldest daughter was working at a law firm where, as a student, she was working like 70 hours a week. I mean, she hated it. She was like, she wasn't complaining because she knew that, I knew one of the senior partners at the law firm. She didn't want anything to get back to him. And so I said to this lawyer, like, why do you guys get to work these young people to the point where they're exhausted, they're not having any fun? I mean, it's probably illegal, immoral, and unethical to work somebody that many hours in the course of a week. And he two responses. First response was, that's how we see what they're made out of. I wanted to drill him, right? Because I'm like, dude, we're not training special ops operators here. We're not saving lives. We're practicing law. I mean, like, how the hell do you find out what somebody's made of by making them work 70 hours a week and not having, it's their summer off, not having any time? And what do you think the next response is? It's like, well, that's how I had to do it, which is another argument that's full of crap, right? I mean, it's like, I had to do it. So, I mean, we used to do lots of things as a human race that we stopped doing because it was the wrong thing to do. I mean, here you have the very institutions that are charged with protecting the rights of employees, right? So when I get sued by an employee, it's usually a law firm that's suing me, representing the employee. When I need help with with employee laws, it's usually a law firm. I go to these same institutions that are protecting employee rights, are working their students and their associates and their interns to the point where I think it's I'm not going to ask for your opinion on this, but I think it's illegal, immoral, and unethical. So I think we're seeing a shift where the largest and most successful corporations in the world, so the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Amazons, the Teslas, the Apples, they've attracted the brightest talent, and a lot of millennials are moving that direction. Not just because, and by the way, they're hugely successful companies. They're the largest market cap of any companies in the history of the world. But they're attracting people because they offer work-life balance. They offer a full year of maternity. Oh my goodness, what a novel idea! It gives somebody a full year off to have a baby. So I think millennials, your generation, the generation that's following you, I don't know what we're going to call them yet, but they're already starting to graduate. Some of you in this class may be of that generation, but I think you know more than we did, and so you expect more, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think I wouldn't go to work for a law firm that demanded that for the first 5 years of my career I work 70 hours a week, and give up the joy of raising a family. I think we should be attracted to companies that provide more than a year's benefits for, for mothers that want to raise a child.
So what challenges did you face in the beginning of your entrepreneurial experience with AMJ Campbell? And as a student who's very interested in entrepreneurship, what would you say are the most difficult obstacles to starting a business and seeking the success as well as fostering a healthy work-life balance?
So I'll start with the last part of the question. Fostering a healthy work-life balance, to me, is something you need to establish really early on in your life. So, prior to beginning a career, prior to becoming an entrepreneur, you need to make looking after yourself as important as your next most important meeting. So, so for me, for example, I know that, if I'm not exercising on a regular basis, I'm just going to get lazy and lethargic, and I just don't feel as, as energetic as I'd like to be. So I just carve out those times, 3 or 4 times a week. Those are my times, and unless it's a family emergency, I keep those times because I know that something would fill it up. I mean, just, it's the nature of life. Something will always fill up. So, setting the right priorities in terms of looking after yourself, work-life balance, feeding yourself with, with good information, reading the right books. I get the argument. People say, Bruce, where do you get the time to do that? And I say, well, the average North American spends 34 hours a week watching TV. I'm not saying you shouldn't watch TV, but cut like 6 hours a week out and spend that doing, healthy lifestyle choices. I think you face challenges all the time as an entrepreneur. I face challenges today. I'll face challenges tomorrow. I think the challenges perhaps you face, for me, for a lot of entrepreneurs, as they grow their business, one of the biggest challenges I think is letting go and not micromanaging everything. So, there's no way we could operate in 50-some locations across country if I needed to micromanage every one of those locations. There's no way you can grow your business from a 5-person business to a 50-person business if you don't develop that quick ability to trust people, to let them do their jobs. And the irony is they're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes, and we all make mistakes. And so I think, a challenge for entrepreneurs is being able to let people run with things and make their own mistakes. And I think there will always be challenges as an entrepreneur, and that's part of life, is just accepting the fact that you never really reach a place, I don't think, where you don't have challenges, where surprises don't happen. I mean, life's about change, especially in the last 10 years, and that's one of the reasons why I love technology is. It's allowed us to change at a pace like nothing we've ever seen, in the history of humankind. And you can either embrace that and enjoy it, or you can be stressed out about it all the time. Maybe letting go of things that aren't working well. So, there's been lots of ideas that I've had over the course of my career where I've said to our management team, we're going to do this, and I invite people to challenge things and to argue it. But I think sometimes entrepreneurs, they think something's going to work, and they hang on to it until the ship goes down versus cutting their losses quick. So, whatever it is you're doing, if you see something's going sideways or isn't working well, like pull the chute on it quickly, and that whole concept of fail quickly and get on with things.
Do you have any interest in the Tesla trucks for your fleet?
I've looked at the Tesla truck, and I've followed, Elon Musk is on my, want to meet list, and would love to spend some time with him. Yeah, no, I mean, most people don't realize he's Canadian. He spent most of his life in Canada, did his first year at Queen's University, grew up in Saskatchewan. I'm just not sure that, I love the way he thinks with the trucks. As I said earlier, I'm just not sure that solution in 5 years' time or 6 years' time or 10 years' time will be in line with infrastructure. So, you can't put an autonomous truck. The biggest issue right now with autonomous vehicles in general is there's no question my car is the safest car on the Garden or the 401 when I'm behind the wheel and it's driving by itself. Problem is all the cars around me aren't. And so that's the issue with with autonomous vehicles, unless we have the infrastructure to support it, which is going to be a lot slower to develop, especially with governments that they're bankrupt or so far in debt that they can't spend on the infrastructure. So I mean, it's a great concept. If we could just put parts of it in place today, like I mentioned earlier, the safety parts, it would be a huge step forward. But I predict that autonomous trucks will be on the roads before autonomous cars.
So just kind of riffing off of the whole hostile takeover thing. I know that in your case it was because you knew that they kind of wanted to chop shop your company up and sell it in parts. But in other cases where sometimes managers are unsure what the effect will be, or like whether the shareholder value will be improved or reduced, how do you sort of handle that ethical dilemma that maybe my job is on the line? And basically my question is about like the agency theory. So it's about your job being on the line as management versus like maximizing shareholder value, which is your obligation as a manager.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a quick answer to that, and the answer is that, both at the time that we went through hostile takeover bid and in today's climate, probably more so today, you have an independent board of governors for public corporations that are tasked with making sure that, if a bid is made to buy the company, that it is in the best interest of all the shareholders. So, what happens in the midst of a hostile takeover bid is the moment that management decides they want to get involved in trying to buy the company, they have to be excused from, in my case, I was on the board, I had to be excused from the board. I could not consult with our corporate counsel or our corporate accounting firms. I was treated as a separate independent party looking at the business. And what that does, that allows an independent board of governors to look at all of the bids out there and make sure that that any of them are in the best interest. And it could be that they say, look at the bid on the table, is this not a good bid for the shareholders? And we say we should just stay put and wait for a better bid, which happens quite often. But yeah, it's out of the hands of management. I mean, there might have been days way back when Ralph, where management might influence the board, but today there's so much responsibility on governance that I don't think you'd see directors do that.
On behalf of Ryerson, I want to thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.